Loud. Okay. All right. They're coming in. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our third, can you believe it, Ways to Equity Network. It's 10:01. We're going to wait a few more minutes to let people in. This is being recorded. So when you do arrive, if everyone could put their name in the chat, that would be great, and where you're from. And now we're up to 17 people. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's 10:02. This is our third Ways to Equity Network, Navigating Equity Network. Thank you for being here. Please put your name in the chat so we know who's here and where you're from. And welcome, welcome, welcome. We'll give it one more minute and then we will go ahead and get started. I'm Kathy Wall. I'm the director of the Inclusion Collaborative, and I'm your host today to our third Navigating Equity Network. And we're delighted that you're here today. If one of our guests could write in the chat, please put your name and where you're from in the chat, that would be great. Thank you, amazing equity team. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, this is our third Ways Navigating Equity Network. Today's January 21st. Can you believe that? And we're here to have our network and discuss using the Ways to Equity playbook. And we're delighted you're here. This professional network is sponsored by Santa Clara County Office of Education, the Inclusion Collaborative, and our co-sponsors, the California Collaboration for Educational Excellence. And so we're delighted you're here. And this has been an ongoing monthly, every third Thursday from 10 to 12, we are here. We'd love to have you join us. And you can pick and choose whenever you're available to attend. These are all recorded and the PowerPoints are on our website, which I'll show you where. And we're here to join and talk with other colleagues that are working on their own student equity journey at their school site in their school district. So we're delighted to have you here and to get to know how to use and the Ways to Equity playbook and get some more information from your colleagues. So this meeting is being recorded, as I mentioned, and we're using our Zoom chat feature to propose questions throughout the meetings. We would love to know who you are, so please, please, please put your name and where you're from in the chat. Questions will be answered in the chat. We also are going to be doing breakout rooms, so we find that when we get into breakout rooms, we're able to have smaller conversations that might add more value to the purpose of this meeting. Please mute yourself because, as you know, mailmen and children and dogs bark, so we are recording this and we'd like to have it as quiet as possible. And thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us. We're delighted to have you here today. Today, we're here to learn more about the Ways to Equity playbook. We find that the more that we touch it and use it and learn about it and talk about it, the more likely we will use it. You're going to get more information and support. And that's actually one of the big goals, is that you learn and talk with other colleagues that are on the same equity journey, or never the same equity journey, but on the equity journey for their own district and school site. So there's a lot of value talking with people, as we know. We want to make sure that everyone knows that this is not the first one, so we're not doing an overview. We have the October 8th statewide webinar recording, which is an overview on our website, and I'll show you where. We have previous Navigating Equity Network meetings all recorded with the PowerPoints on our website, and we have lots of tools and supports to help you utilize the Ways to Equity playbook. So if you go to Santa Clara County Office of Education.org, that's the home site for the Santa Clara County Office of Education. We actually have real estate, the carousel at the top here These all move on our website, but one of them has this beautiful California One Highway to Success with the Ways to Equity Playbook information. And if you just click right here, so there's the Santa Clara County Office of Education. If you click here for digital copy of the Ways to Equity Playbook, you will arrive at the Inclusion Collaborative Ways to Equity webpage. And right here is where you can access your free copy of the Ways to Equity Playbook. On this side has lots of tools that have been curated to help you support your use of the Ways to Equity Playbook. And over here on this side has links to previous Ways to Equity network meetings that we've had with the recordings, and also the overview of the state webinar that we held in October, and also the flyer if you're wanting to share out the network meetings with your colleagues. And so those are the three that you click onto. I love those pink arrows. They're my favorite color. Today's contributors, we have Dr. Erica Boas. Can you raise your hand and smile? Yay! And we have Dr. Angela Burtz. Yay! Thank you for being here. And Dr. Anne Marie Villalobos. Thank you for being here. And Kelly Wiley. And all of those folks have contributed towards the document, Ways to Equity Playbook. And I'm hosting it today, and I'm Kathy Wall, the director of the Inclusion Collaborative. So far, what we've done in the last two equity networks that we've had is define equity. We've talked about on-ramps. Really important to know where to get started on your equity journey. So there's on-ramps at the beginning and continuing your equity journey that we've discussed. We've looked at building an equity leadership team because that's really critical on your site. We've talked about culturally relevant pedagogy. And we've also talked about suspension rates and school discipline. So we are moving forward with quite a few things from the table of contents, as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, and it's page 4 of the Ways to Equity Playbook. I should mention that if you want your own hard copy of the Ways to Equity Playbook, you can email inclusion@sccoe.org and we can mail one to you for $20 total cost. So it is my great honor to now introduce my colleague, Dr. Anne Marie Villalobos, who will continue on with our network meeting. Thank you, Anna Marie.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. So when we look at this slide, and if we really want to think about the ways to equity and the path that we are all on, it makes sense to have checkpoints along the way, just as you have checkpoints when you're going on a road trip, right? And we want to reflect upon our practice and think about the ways we have been equity road warriors, essentially. And since our last meeting, I want you to think about the following questions, and we're going to do a Jamboard activity, but I just want you to reflect for a moment before we go to the Jamboard about your equity actions since our last meeting. How did you identify your equity warriors? Who are they? What have you tried? What barriers did you encounter? And where were your celebrations? And who were your celebrations with? That's an important question too. So I already, in the chat, I did put the Jamboard. Oh, thank you. Someone else just put it back in again. And if you want to go ahead and go into the chat and click on that link and think about these questions, we can go ahead and we can start seeing what we have to share. Okay, thank you very much. And can you click on the Jamboard for me? Or do I need to do this? Do I need to go out?
Anna Marie, is that what you wanted on the screen?
I can't, am I on the screen? I can't see. Hold on a second.
Kelly, is
That
that the correct Jamboard?
That is the correct link, but if you'll scroll up at the top, if you'll scroll over, I believe it's one more. So if you go up just a little bit, there's two small, yep.
Whew. Can everybody see that now? Someone asked which frame, and now hopefully we have the right frame.
Yeah, I was trying to find the frames.
That's actually the one for the next activity.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so let's start with our first question. How do you identify your equity warriors? How did you identify your equity warriors, and who are they? Oh, thank you. I was just going to put that in there. I won't get rid of that.
So I can see we figured out the Jamboard and we are on the correct Jamboard. Things are happening. If you look on our screen. So if you feel like you are able to answer any of these questions, just go to the bar on the left and grab a sticky note, which is under the arrow, and pull it out and click on it and start typing, and then we can put it into the appropriate columns. That is a barrier.
Yeah. This is, if you can see over here, I'm circling with the cursor, the little hand, and it says sticky note. some good discussion points. Yes, time is a barrier.
I like the barrier time. That is the barrier to everything, it seems like.
Interesting. So a lot of different, it looks like there's a lot of different approaches that people have tried.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, everyone, for your input here.
Yes, thank you.
Time and schedules, yes.
Mhm.
Or silence, that's definitely another barrier.
I'm glad that people have had an opportunity to celebrate too, it looks like. Creating networking meetings, that's a time and schedule. Yeah, that's a really good tactic. And some of you, it looks like, have long-term plans. And some are at the very beginning, which is great. Wow.
That's actually a good way to,
Great to-
if you're doing, which we need to, an ethnic studies course, that's a good way to open the discussion of equity and having an equity team.
Mhm. Well, this is great. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. We're going to go ahead and switch now. I mean, there's some great actions people have taken,
Mm-hmm.
and also I mean, I think this is a really interesting barrier. You know, we always know about time and schedule, but the idea of the difficulty trying it to the work of prospective equity warriors, since we can't guarantee what the results of our equity work will end up being.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really interesting statement, and something that, you know, hopefully the playbook can help you with in terms of process. But that's a really interesting you know, idea to share, because I can see where that would be something, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
people that would be something that people would consider. Well, what is this going to look like in the end?
Right.
So thank you for
And we're
sharing.
so outcomes based. Yep.
Yep. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We're going to move on from that activity and talk about our journey.
Oh, that's another good one too, the one that was just added. Okay, so our journey today, let me go, is if we're looking at this, our journey, let me go ahead and get out of this. For some reason it won't let me, but I'll just go ahead. Let me pop out. Okay, so today's journey. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. I really appreciate your sharing the work that you have been doing and the people you have been working with. So today's journey really has a focus on capacity building. Okay, and the tools that you can use to assist yourself and your equity warriors in addressing implicit bias. So we're all about capacity building, but today specifically, we're going to be talking about, first, we're going to be talking about implicit bias, and then we will go ahead to cultivating equity mindedness. So if you notice at the start of the journey, we leave from where we left off last time, which was identifying your equity warriors, to addressing your equity warriors. Then we're moving to implicit bias, and then on to cultivating equity mindedness. So, and also at the end of this session, we have a tool, a questionnaire for you to use as your next step. And this will assist you in our next session on creating a culture of belonging and inclusion. And you'll find out about more of this as we get towards the end of our session. So right now, it's my pleasure to move it on over to Dr. Erica Boas.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here with you. And really, thank you for sharing all of that. I think it's important that we all know how much work is being done out there and that we are in this work together. I think that's a huge part of what we are trying to do here. I mean, I also chatted something out that asked you all to share ideas. You know, we come together in this network and it's 2 hours a month, but if there are ways that we can connect to your work or that you think we can connect these different pieces together, we're a huge county and there's a lot being done. And so if you have ideas for that, we're really open to hearing. I think that's, you know, necessary for us to continue this systemic work. So today we are, as Anna Marie pointed out, talking about implicit bias and equity mindedness. And so we have this, this section in the Ways to Equity playbook that can be found on page 33 that really goes into the relationship between implicit bias and equity mindedness. And so I want to talk very briefly about how we see implicit bias, what we think its role is in the work, and how we can kind of make sure that we're attending to that while still attending to the structures that uphold the systems, right? That one produce implicit bias, but also are informed by our implicit biases as well. So it's very complicated. So we hope that you'll read that section in full because there are a lot of resources in there that we draw upon, and we know that we can't, every section of the playbook, and I think we say this every time, is could be an entire book in itself. So it's very congealed, but we do have a lot of resources and citations in there that we think are worth reading. I also want to provide a little bit of a caveat before, I apologize for, you know, putting all these words up here. You might be reading it now, but let me provide a caveat before we go into this. So by now, most of us know what implicit bias is, and that there's a tendency for us to think equity work has to start here. So we agree that implicit bias is necessary to understand and address, but we also simultaneously recognize that unless we match our work on implicit bias to our work to change the structures that hold inequities in place, we'll see little progress in our equity work. So we need to do things as much as we can simultaneously, our internal system and the external system. Okay, so that's how I like to think about it. We are an entire system in ourselves, but we exist in this broader system. Okay, so what is implicit bias? So the Curran Institute, which we draw on in the playbook, defines implicit bias as attitudes, stereotypes, beliefs that affect our understanding and actions in an unconscious manner. Okay, so if we have unconscious belief systems, our beliefs can result in unintended and sometimes detrimental outcomes. And these are the outcomes we want to address. However, our biases are malleable. We need to believe that our biases and the biases of other people are malleable. They're also necessary for us to be able to make snap judgments, right? To make decisions in our everyday life, but we need to sometimes slow down, right? Those snap judgments to understand what it is that we're thinking and why we think that way. So we can interrupt and change our mindsets and our systems because our brains, beliefs, and systems are malleable. Okay, so the first belief system we have to hold is that we can change and that people can change. Okay, so like I said, we start by understanding our system. So the internal system of the mind, and we look to mindset change, right? So developing new ways of thinking, such as debiasing, which we go into a bit in the playbook, and equity mindedness, which we'll be lingering on a little bit today in our second breakout. We also look to systems change, right? Structural change. So we need to analyze the policies and structures that support inequities. For example, African-American boys being suspended and expelled at greater rates than all other student groups, and English learners being over-identified for special education, and certainly certain learning disabilities within that. We also need to attend to the people who make up the systems, these systems, and who make the tools. So during the network meetings, we'll have 2 breakout sessions. The first will be to explore implicit biases, and the second will be to explore equity mindedness and how to make equity moves in your context. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so we don't know how many people had a chance to engage in Harvard's Project Implicit Assessment or Implicit Bias Test. We sent out an email earlier asking you to do some of this pre-work. If you did not, we still 100%, 110% invite you into this conversation. But if you did, we would love to learn from you about how you felt and thought about the results you got. Also, if you've taken an implicit bias test in the past, you can refer to that past experience as you respond here. So we have set up a poll for you. And we're asking, what feelings or reactions did you have upon learning your implicit bias assessment results? And before we put that up, let me go over a couple of the common reactions that people might have. Okay, so you might feel disbelief that the results conflict with your worldview or your view of yourself. Disregard, you question whether or not your score should be different, would be different, that actually it's not reflective, that it doesn't make a difference. Acceptance, understanding your results and why you have the associations you do. So implicit bias is about making associations about people, really, to other ideas, And then discomfort, accepting the accuracy of your implicit bias assessment results, but you're upset or maybe uncomfortable with your results. And then distress, feelings of elevated concern with your results. And this might spark reflection on personal responsibility, but it may also lead you to just not wanting to deal with it, right? So there could be that kind of dismissal there too. Okay, so Kathy, if you'll please put up the poll, and everybody please engage if you feel you can. And this includes, I think, our team as well. Thank you. I see the numbers rolling in here. So we have 9 people who've responded. Oh. 11 people have responded. Thank you. And if you have never taken an implicit bias test, we have a few linked in, well, the Harvard one is linked in the playbook, and there are others out there too that you could take. Okay, let's give this 30 more seconds. Okay, so let's take a look at these results. We are quite an open-minded group here, right? So 12 out of 13 of us accept our results, which I think is a really fantastic sign. And then a person, an honest, not that nobody else was honest, but expressing discomfort around these results. So what we would like you to do next is further the reflection by, oh, so now we can share the results, right? Oh, you all can't see what I'm saying. I'm so sorry. Okay, we're sharing the results now. Can everybody see this? And actually, before we go into the reflection, if anybody has questions or thoughts, you can share them in the chat. Thank you, Kelly. Okay, so let us go to the next slide. We're going to ask you to take 3 minutes to do a reflection before we head into our breakout sessions. We would like you to reflect on your life experiences, those that may have influenced the results you got. So your family upbringing, the neighborhoods in which you've lived, who you've lived with, who's been your neighbors, elements of your career path, media messages, etc. Anything that may have influenced your results. And how might these experiences have shaped your biases with or without your conscious awareness, right? So we're asking you to kind of take a mirror to yourself and look at yourself. This is all confidential. We're not going to actually ask you to share these things. This is more for us to set up the breakouts. And then second, how might knowing your results from your assessment affect your future actions and decisions, both in your role at your workplace and in other aspects of your life? So let me just take a moment to talk about myself here. I grew up in a divorced family. My dad is white and Jewish and Dutch. My mom is Japanese American, 3rd generation. And I mostly grew up with my mom, and in our family, we were told that, we were taught about the civil rights movement and justice, but we were also told to not make waves, right? So both of these have been competing. These have been competing in my life for the entirety of my lifetime, because on the one hand, I want to speak out and be vocal. On the other hand, I have this messaging in me that says, don't, right? Don't make waves. Do what you need to do the right thing. But really, you don't want to cause problems. And that was never said explicitly. That was more of a messaging that happened in my home when I would do things and get in trouble, and then be told, that I shouldn't be, right? And getting in trouble for getting in good trouble even, right? Speaking out. So I want to share that as kind of an example of how my life experiences have played out in kind of my different roles that I've played. And so I also want to share that it can be hard for me to be presenting, right? Because it is speaking out, right? And speaking my mind and speaking my truth. So it's never easy for me. So with that, I would like to give you those 3 minutes that we offered. So please write. Okay, one more minute. Okay. So thank you for taking the time to write or reflect or whatever it was that you did in this moment. We're going to move into our breakouts now. So for this breakout, we'll draw on the implicit bias assessment you took. We see that as like something personal you did. So just remember, you can reference it, but you don't need to, we're not asking you to disclose anything in this moment. But we'll draw on that. And it's, again, perfectly okay if you were not able to take the assessment. There's plenty of time to do that. Next slide, please, Kathy. So in this discussion, we're asking you to think about how you were taught about race, gender, disability, and language, and how might this teaching impact your implicit biases, right? So first, we've asked you to do this in your reflection, answer the question through examination of the explicit teaching you've received. And next, answer the question through examination of the implicit teaching you've received. And I want to point out here that that idea of explicit teaching versus implicit teaching can sometimes be blurred. There are some blurry areas there. So don't worry too much about like getting that exactly right. What we're really getting at here is kind of like, what have you been told? Like what's in your immediate and what's sort of out there in the ether? We're not sure. Okay. And then finally, what steps do you take to interrupt your own unconscious biases? Okay, so for example, some things that we might do is kind of the debiasing, right? Which is to, if we recognize, if we're honest with ourselves and recognize that we have biases, something you might do is, if you're holding these stereotypes, is kind of inundate your mind with ideas about people that don't match those stereotypes, right? That's one kind of strategy around debiasing that we use. But for the conversation, we want to hear from you what you might use, right? What strategies you might use, whether you've been conscious of them or not. Take a moment to think about that, and we'll share them in our breakout sessions. Can I answer any questions for people before we go in? Okay, so let's move into our breakout session.
So these are going to be anonymous or assigned randomly, correct? So I'd like everyone to buckle up, travel safely, and we'll see you in how many minutes?
Let's say 25.
25, okay. And we're going to go ahead and put the questions in the chat, correct? Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you, Kelly.
Angela and I ended up in the same room, so I said
yeah.
I would exit out and go somewhere else if you want to send me somewhere else.
You want to go to room 4?
Yeah, wherever.
There's only 2 people there.
Yeah, that's fine.
Hi, Angela. So those of you that have not done so, if you could put your name and where you're from in the chat, that would be really fun. Then we know who's here today. Welcome back, everybody. You made it safe and sound.
Yeah, let me just finish my sentence. Thank all of you for sharing. I couldn't get it out in time.
That's what happens. I know. It's crazy.
Okay. Oh, it's nice to see everybody. We don't get the everybody view when we're in presentation mode. Are we waiting for another group to come back?
No, but it tells me that I'm not in presentation mode. Can you guys see the screen? No. Well, that's what happens when you go on a trip to a breakout room. There we go.
Okay. So if we're, I just want to put out there for us, if we're this small of a group, maybe we don't need another breakout room next time.
Right.
Anyway, so let's do a whole group share out with our intimate group here around the 3 questions that were posed. How did you learn, and how has that learning manifested? Let's just take a few moments to talk. Anyone want to share?
To get us started. Oh, someone's there too. So I was in the group with, where are they? Cindy, and there was one other person. Oh, did she leave? Well, we talked about, to answer the question, we talked about just a socialization process, what that looked like in the home as well as in the school site, and how when the experience at home mirrors your school site, there's no dissonance. So that means if you're able to speak your language, or aesthetically you're able to be yourself, or you're able to show up in a classroom as a learner where you're feeling affirmed. I share my personal experience of growing up in a home where having a pro-Black identity was something that was espoused every day in terms of messaging. And that was also reiterated in my classrooms because my teachers were African-American. So I felt very comfortable until I was in an environment where people weren't able to be themselves, but without recognizing that where implicit bias came to the forefront for me was being very frustrated of seeing other people of color, Black namely, and then also Latinos, not being themselves was frustrating for me. And it helped me understand that I actually took for granted what it felt like to be comfortable in the space, and even recognizing that that's not a socialization process that everyone has an opportunity to have, and it shows. And so I bring that up to say, as an equity practitioner and as someone who does work with students, families, as well as administrators with issues of race, I'm always mindful not to project and to be empathetic about where people are in their process and who they actually, in the competing factors that will prevent them from being themselves, because it is a process, and there are so many challenges. So I'm always mindful of my experience as a young person and what made that really challenging for me, to know that I meet people who don't talk about race in the home, and it's not my job to judge. It's actually my job to be a resource and to be a safe space to talk about the limitations for that, for their kids who actually need it. And then some people share their experience, what that looked like for language and what that looked like from being in a predominantly white experience. And I don't know if people in my group also want to share.
You did great, Angela. Thank you.
This is a space for all of us. And so, you can share or not share and feel comfortable with both. So does anybody, before we move on to talking about equity mindedness, we would love to hear from you if you want to share. And if you feel that you can't share because your sound, maybe your connection may be off, we are patient here too, and we invite you in as well. We know that we don't want technology to be a barrier.
You can always share in the chat too, if that's more comfortable.
Anyone else?
I'll speak for our group. Just in a quick summary, we talked about how we can be the angelic troublemaker and not have some of our experiences repeat in adulthood, and that we were and we are thankful for the opportunity to have the mindedness to, one, be aware, and two, be proactive in the decision making that follows.
Thank you. Yeah, and we had somebody share in our group that they, to Kathy's point here, this activity can be used to start these conversations at your site. So these kind of conversation, we had somebody share that they already shared the questions with colleagues. So thank you. Okay, let's move on. I would like to introduce Dr. Angela Burks, even though she doesn't need any introduction, but invite her in to take us through the next part of this.
Thank you, Dr. Boaz. All right, good morning, everyone. So we Dr. Boaz talked about the idea of the brains and beliefs being malleable, in that implicit bias is something that it can be addressed. So I just want to emphasize some key points around the concept of equity mindedness, which consists of attitudes and beliefs that lead to individual and collective behaviors that foster equitable outcomes. There are some definitions listed there, but I want to read one explicitly that really offers a better understanding of what the process looks like. And it comes from the University of Southern California's Center of Urban Education. And they express that equity-minded practitioners question their own assumptions, recognize stereotypes that harm student success, and continually reassess their practices to create change. The activity that we did in the previous part of this session around thinking about messages around language and race identity, it really is an opportunity to be self-aware about how our personal upbringings, our exposure, in fact, do impact how we show up in the workplace and impact our decision making. So I stress that to say that first step of like taking a test around implicit bias or acknowledging your background and where you're coming from is very much important to develop an equity mindedness. It can be inferred sometimes that in doing the work that you jump directly into the action piece, but I firmly believe when it comes to the work around equity, diversity, and in terms of influencing student outcomes, it's really an inside out approach. Looking inward first is just as important as it is to start to impact change. I believe it's one of the first steps. So if we think about it this way, then it's not necessarily essential to eliminate bias before taking an equity mindedness approach, because the work of equity for ourselves and unpacking our biases is ongoing work. We should constantly think about how we show up in spaces and constantly think about how our personal belief systems might impact consequently different groups and what we do. So I pose some questions centered around this that could be helpful in the educational space in terms of thinking about what equity mindedness is. And then I'll address a tool that you can use. So questions around what practices are in place at your site to ensure that people have the time, space, and resources to engage in reflection of their implicit biases. It's vulnerable work. It requires honesty. So how can that be facilitated in your current context to where people feel that it's actually safe and okay to be honest and transparent? Like I'd imagine many of you felt, I hope, today when you were in your breakout session. And other questions centered around thinking about being equity minded is around in what ways are students authentically recognized and celebrated in your school community for their identity, for their talents that they bring into the classroom. And lastly, how are you continuously investigating and developing asset-based approaches to your instruction and your behavior management, keeping in mind that you want to be equitable, fair, and treat all students according to what they need. Next slide, please. So to provide some more context, in the Ways to Equity playbook, toward the end, I'm drawing a blank on exactly what page number it is, but there are tools and assessments that you can use. So going back to that personal level, that the equity mindedness, when you're looking inside, you're thinking about your biases. There's also practically the structural and at the institutional level. In addition to reflecting on questions, there are proactive ways in which you can look at how equity fares within your school context in your district on a large scale. And one of the ways to get there is around using some tools. So there are criteria for creating an equitable school. And I'll just read this definition verbatim from the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium. And they argue that an equitable school provides a climate, process, and content which enables students and staff to perform at their highest level. An equitable school ensures successful academic outcomes by providing equitable resources and appropriate instructional strategies for each student. And a step to thinking about where your institution is to perform an audit. And it's two type approaches you can take. You could perform an audit for administrators at the leadership level, but you can also do audits centered around teacher and pedagogy around CRP. There are many different audits, but the one that I'll speak to today will be a part of the work that you will do for our next session. And it does come from the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium. So they have an audit, and very briefly, the particular audit that I'll recommend is multiple audits combined together. And it really does focus on 3 specific tools: one around a criteria for an equitable school, a criteria for an equitable classroom, and teacher behaviors that encourage student persistence. So just thinking about those questions and assessing equity in that threefold manner could be very useful to take a step back and say, how is our institution doing? And with the particular tool, it focuses on specific areas that will create that bigger picture, holistic approach to understanding how your school is doing and what the gaps and the needs are. And those areas include questions around school policy, around school organization and administration, around culture and belonging, staff, assessment and placement, professional learning, and standards and curriculum development. So you'll learn more about that tool in our next session. And those are different tools that are combined together. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do next is we're going to spend more time thinking about how to have an equity mindedness when you're having to address implicit bias that comes up in your school. And so you'll return, I believe that actually we're going to stay together since the group is smaller, but I will read the next scenario that we'll focus on in our session together. Next slide, please.
We will stay in one group, okay? We don't want to lose anybody.
Next slide, please. So here's a scenario around implicit biases and equity mindset. And this is based on a true story. So I want you to imagine this. It is August and the school year is about to begin. Elementary school teachers at a new charter school of about 130 students are excitedly creating class assignments for the upcoming year. The first, second, and third grade teachers are deciding which students will go into which classes by sorting index cards with student names and profiles on them. The teachers are Mrs. Avila, a Latinx woman, and Mrs. Green, a white woman. Both are in their late 20s. The following dialogue ensues. Mrs. Green: right now I have 5 African-American boys on my list. Do you mind taking Anthony? I find that African-American boys can sometimes get a little rambunctious when they're together. She laughs. Miss Avila: I don't mind, give Anthony to me. Mrs. Green: yeah, I think that will be best. So I'll just give you time to process that a bit before we go to our next slide. Okay, next slide. So here's what I like to focus on us to have a conversation around. First, where do you see implicit bias at play in this scenario? Secondly, what would be an equity-minded approach to disrupting the implicit bias apparent here? And lastly, keep in your mind and role, what is your institutional responsibility to address an equity challenge like this one? So let's discuss.
And if you don't feel like talking verbally, you may go ahead and use the chat. Thank you so much.
Do you want to bring us back together and unshare, and then I can paste the questions in there so we can see each other?
Angela, do you have the questions? Yep.
Yes, it's in there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. You're absolutely right.
I think that point, Cindy, that you made is, I mean, it's really like, it's overt, it's obvious. But at the same time, it makes me wonder about that relationship between what's explicit and what's implicit. What is implicit about this and what's explicit about this, right? So by virtue of the teacher, who is it, Mrs. Green, pointing out that they're African-American, right? Does that make this explicit, or is it that she's saying they're rambunctious, right? That makes this about bias, right? So where, like that question around where is the implicit bias, I think is really important for us to identify. You know, at what level is it operating? At what point do we get to say like, oh, that's racist and know that it is? And, you know, because sometimes it can be really hard to say, hey, that sounds racist, right? Because it is so implicit. So I wonder if we can kind of unpack that a little bit.
I mean, even as a mother of boys, and I speak to mothers of only girls, they're like, oh, I'm so nervous around your boys. Oh my gosh, they're gonna fall off of this. Oh, I could have never had boys. So even that alone, this isn't just about the race in this scenario. It also goes back to the biases on the whole female, male gender situation also. So it's a combination of a lot of biases, and also this lack of awareness of, like I just directly said, how boys are, and how it's more specifically how Black boys are. You know what I mean? Like this whole, sorry, I was really bothered by it, but it's like those types of comments I hear all day long. So it really triggered so many different thoughts.
Thank you, Rhonda and Victor. Both of those comments piggyback beautifully on what Cindy just very eloquently stated.
I also wonder if there's a factor, the classroom management of the teacher. We don't know in the scenario, but maybe it's a different problem that she's attributing to the students that might be a skill set that she might need to improve. She or he may need to improve.
Yeah, so what's it saying about her? Yes.
You know, working at a high school, I think it's very different than an elementary school in so many different ways. But one of the ways I think is that classes are randomly assigned when we create a master schedule, right? So this idea that people sit down and decide who they get as students, I think is can be really dangerous sometimes, because you can make those decisions on these criteria that are, you know, just set by individual people and maybe not in line with, you know, the values and mission and goals of a school. So I would much rather have a system where students are just randomly assigned, and that's just how it works.
Victor, we actually, when we were prepping for today, had that exact same discussion, and that at the secondary level, so 6 through 12, where For the most part, the computer is generating your classes based upon the input of the master schedule, is so different than when the elementary school teachers in May or June, whenever your school year ends, they do sit in a staff meeting with their cards and shuffle and deal based upon the finding the as much of a gender balance as they can, because that's required by law. And then the rest of it really becomes, unfortunately, becomes oh, I had that family. That's a really tough family. How about you take it this year, or whatever the implicit bias that comes into play. I mean, take your pick, but
I
it
think at
just
the
speaks to
secondary,
the systemic part of it.
I think though at the secondary level, it's not as all random as we think it is. Because there's certain tracks and certain students are in those tracks, whether it be AP or honors or whatever. So there's that piece. That's a systemic issue. And then the other piece of it is for students with disabilities. Some districts have caps on how many students with disabilities you can have in a class. Or I have too many and this teacher has too many, or this teacher never has. So there still is some of that goes on. It just may not be as out in the open and as prevalent. So I think there are other systemic things that are built in at the secondary level that also need to be addressed in terms of this, in terms of equity and and a bias. Because a lot of times those students in special ed, there are students of color.
Yeah, and one of the things we've done to try to combat that, because that's absolutely correct and tracking does happen, is starting to build the master schedule instead of the highest courses, and like making sure the AP courses are, established first and then working your way down, starting with our special ed parallel courses first, and then working our way to those AP courses. And one of the things I've really tried to challenge our AP teachers on is I don't give a flip if a student takes AP course or takes AP test or not.
Mm-hmm.
If they want to be in your class and be challenged in a way that they wouldn't be challenged in a CP course, why not? Why, hold them accountable to the test that costs $95, whatever. Anyway, so yes, it absolutely happens at the secondary level. And the case management for SPED students, absolutely. They try to sit down and try to go over and say the exact same thing. Oh, I've had 3 kids from that same family. I can't do it one more year. Well, you get the kids that you get, and we educate who shows up at our front door, and that's just how it goes. But I didn't mean to say that like there are no biases at the secondary level, and absolutely we need to challenge those. I was just reacting to the idea of sitting down with like those cards. And
when that part around intersectionality is important as well, because when I think about where a student zip code is, particularly for students who are bused to attend school, even at the elementary and secondary level, I think about in East Palo Alto, they have the Tinsley program. And in East Palo Alto, many students are bused to attend school within a Sequoia Unified School District. And having worked for like programs like College Track, the students' future pretty much is set for them before they step foot on that campus. They are placed in the lowest tier of the school, sometimes remedial classes. Some students have disabilities, other students don't have disabilities. But I think with being the equity mindedness and the conversation, systemically that has to happen, is addressing the biases that some schools hold when it comes to students, not just about race, but where they're actually coming from, their neighborhoods, and their assessment of how well their elementary or secondary schools prepare them, or how well the Head Start program or whatever pre-education they had to be successful in a different environment, versus what do we do to set this student up for success and give them an equitable experience just as someone else, even if they didn't have the level of preparedness. So I do want to just emphasize that point around intersectionality, the way that class, race, and learning style coupled together puts families and students in a situation where their opportunities are decided for them at the onset of them stepping foot on the campus. The second question was, how do you approach it with the equity mindedness in this scenario, or even some of the stuff that has come up? What do those conversations look like in your setting, or who would you go to have this conversation?
Yeah, I want to lift up Tara's contribution in the chat here. I know that she may be having some tech issues. So an equity-minded approach is a holistic look at how those kids have been successful and had fun in lots of settings around the school, and B, consideration of how to structure my teacher's class or a teacher's class in a shape that fits my students rather than try to shape my students to fit a rigid structure in the class. So that requires that's when we talk about the system, right? Our system of thinking that matches a new system of being. We think about a classroom as a place where kids need to learn how to be, right? As opposed to a classroom and a teacher where they have to learn how to be, how to invite the kids in, right? And I think this really speaks to next week or next month's creating a culture of inclusion and belonging session that we'll do. So, a plug for our next session to please invite people in, because we want to have these robust conversations. This is a really important point. Thank you.
Kelly, I like what you just said. UDL says you cannot change the student, but you can change the environment, and that the barriers live in the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the whole crux for universal design for learning. So just to kind of emphasize Tara's point.
And I would just like to put a plug that there's a whole section on universal design for learning in the Ways to Equity playbook.
How are we doing on time for this section?
I think we've got about 5 minutes.
So I am curious, if this was, you were Mrs. Avila, is that correct? Who would you go talk to? If I knew Mrs. Green fairly well, I'd probably say, whoa, whoa, whoa. As Cindy pointed out, if you've lived or worked with boys, they're a lot of fun. And she just made a lot of assumptions there and then pulled the race card. So interesting thoughts. Anyone?
I think that building trust and relationships
Mhm.
are like the how you open windows of opportunities to have these
Mhm.
honest conversations. And I think that those are the moments that once you have some type of trust built, that allows you to have. I would have, if that was a teacher that's already sending kids over my way, I must already have a relationship with that
Mhm.
teacher. And I think that taking away that fear of stating like, hey, I noticed you said this, just kind of noticing these things and bringing it to their attention.
Mhm.
There's nothing wrong in that. I mean, it's like, I don't know why we feel like we have to walk on eggshells all the time about it, especially when it comes to doing what's right for students.
Mhm.
And I think that those are the conversations that I tend to have more with people that I know that I'm working with.
Mhm.
And there's many times where I have to keep my mouth shut because I don't have that trust. I don't have that relationship. They don't know what angle I'm coming in from, and I don't know where they're coming from either. And so I think it has to start with that.
Mhm.
Yes, it has to come from like something greater and bigger, but in that moment, we have that much power if we have that trust in that relationship. Like to not lead in fear, but to walk in within knowledge. I think that's what's powerful. That's what you could say at that moment with Miss Avila.
Thank you, Cindy. That was powerful. And I agree. It's got to come from that basis of trust.
And Wendy,
I
And-
like what Wendy put in the chat. Perhaps gently pushing back and guiding the conversation to discuss further who each individual child is, rather than lumping these boys into one group with generalizations about who they are and who they are in the world. I really like that, because that's a nice way to approach that. Well, let's talk about, so-and-so and that, whatever, because one of the most powerful things, and someone brought this up earlier, is to counter it with different stories about their experiences. I think the use of counter stories is very powerful in this situation. And being able to utilize that and have those something to, pull out of your back pocket, I think it's just absolutely, it's really, really powerful. And the use of counter stories, especially when we're using, when students get to use their own counter stories to disrupt this kind of thing. And as people within the educational system, our own stories, I think that's a really powerful way to approach this.
Thank you, Anna Marie. Tara, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, is my audio okay for you guys?
It's perfect.
Okay. To add to what Dr. Villalobos was saying and what Cindy was saying, and Wendy in the chat also, I could imagine myself being really tongue-tied in the moment. And I could imagine really leaning into that now that I see Wendy's suggestion written out like that, to just say, yeah, let me think about it, and then come back after you can, figure out what a good counter story is. But then conversely, I think to something Cindy mentioned, I think maybe there's a way we can be encouraging of teachers, sounds like young teachers, early career teachers in this scenario, that if you lose relationship with your colleague, that's not the worst outcome. I mean, that you really have to weigh that, but maybe that's the right thing to happen here. Like maybe it's okay to be direct, and if she can't handle it, that's not your fault, So I don't know, just a couple different ways that I started thinking about it.
I was thinking, if I was a teacher, another teacher with that teacher and being in that conversation, I think I might say, really, that hasn't been my experience. And then just give some examples, Bobby, he, examples of African-American boys that didn't meet her stereotype, and then examples of other races who were rambunctious, a Chinese student who was rambunctious, or, a white student who was rambunctious. I mean, it's not hard to find all that. And
girls.
yeah, and girls, thank you. And the, trying to do it in a way that doesn't feel like you're wrong, shut you down, because now I've ended the conversation. But if I'm like, oh, really, actually, last year I had so-and-so and I didn't see that, but boy, Bobby over there, he was driving me a little bit crazy, but I found that if I put him in a collaborative groups more often, he got his talking out, and it really progressed the learning. Like, we don't always have that right in the moment. I think if I was an administrator and found out about it, I might have to address it more directly. And I would probably have other information about classroom management practices and stuff. And was I doing my job,
Thank you, Rhonda.
I like how the conversation went into strategies. And I think it's useful because there are different mechanisms that we would employ to address or disrupt implicit bias. And it could vary from situation to situation, and just things to notice, right? When there are dynamics, what might that look like? If you're speaking directly to your supervisor versus you're speaking to your colleague, if you have a tenure at the school where you're at versus you're a new staff, right? So all those different approaches are important. And I just appreciate what everyone shared, because I've learned a lot, and there's a lot to learn on what are those different strategies and what might it mean when it's in the moment. Is in the moment the right approach for some of these scenarios, or do you wait till later, right? but the fact that there are all those different options that you all provided was very useful. So thank you. I believe we have next part of this presentation, right?
So before we begin on the Jamboard activity, I just want to take a moment to echo what Angela was saying and what Erica had put in the chat. And thank you for engaging in the conversation. I know that it can sometimes be intimidating when there's a large group like that, but that was a really rich conversation. And I know I'm walking away with a new perspective and a new learning, which is, I greatly appreciate it. I always try and have a nugget to walk away with each one. So thank you. So in this particular Jamboard activity, we want to just take a moment for you to have some reflection on your learnings today and put it in your own context. So what is an implicit bias that you would like to disrupt? How are you going to go about being that angelic troublemaker? And that will be on the left-hand side of the Jamboard. And then on the right-hand side of the Jamboard would be what concrete equity-minded next steps are you going to take to stop or disrupt the inequities that you're seeing. So we'll drop the Jamboard link into the chat. And remember that you access the stickies on the very left side of the Jamboard. And sticky away. You're not limited to just one. And you're not limited to just one implicit bias that you would like to disrupt. So go ahead and, excuse me, go ahead and take a moment and populate that.
And I will put it on our screen so we can all see what people are doing. And is it number 12 now? There it is.
And as that begins to populate, if there's a particular sticky that resonates with you, if you just want to draw a star or a check mark, put a +1 on there, that's perfectly fine as well. There are some really rich contributions being made to the Jamboard. We're just going to give it another minute. And I'm impressed with the stars. I know my signature doesn't look anything like my signature when you do this. So the fact that people can make stars is amazing. Also just want to encourage that this is a marathon, not a sprint. Start small. Start with something that speaks to you, that you're passionate about, because that passion is really going to catapult the conversation, and it's going to keep it alive, and it's going to help you rally your like-minded equity warriors. So it's really about keeping the conversation in the forefront, right? And making sure that you push back when there's some uncomfortableness or something doesn't sit right. And being brave enough to speak up. Chances are that there are several other people in the room that are feeling the same thing. So if one person is brave enough to give it voice, then rally around that person and or the concept that they're proposing. Feel free to continue to add thoughts and leave encouragement on the notes that resonate with you. But Kathy, if we can progress forward one more. Perfect, thank you. So as Angela, my apologies. As Angela mentioned earlier, when she was discussing equity audits, she had said that she had proposed some questions. So what she brilliantly did was take one of the equity audits and put it in a Google format for you. So if you click on where it says questionnaire, and we can put the link in the chat for you as well. But she has made it a lot more accessible. So thank you, Angela. So the intent is for you to go through as your homework, if you will, and sit with it for a while and really answer the questions as they pertain to you in your school setting. And then what we will do is we will take the responses, particularly in the creating a culture of inclusion and belonging. We will take those responses and give shape to our next meeting, which will be in February. So then the other nice thing about that is you do not have to answer all of the questions. Angela was kind enough to, if you want to just take a small section at a time, you can do that. You can skip questions. You are not limited to, I have to give a response in order to move on. So like I said, we will really focus in on the culture of inclusion and belonging because we want to continue the school climate conversation and how you create an equitable culture in our next session. We also strongly encourage you to continue to identify your equity warriors and to continue those courageous conversations. Next slide, please. So we will meet again February 18th. And again, that's going to be based upon your responses. So you have an active voice in that. And if you have colleagues that you feel would be a value add to that conversation as well, please share that questionnaire link with them. Just they did not have to be present today in order to take it, and invite them to join us. And then the following or remaining 3 sessions, we're going to take some time to really dive into the 3 student groups that the playbook puts a focus on. So we'll look at exactly in March how we can go about best supporting our African American students. And then in April, we will do the same with our students with disabilities. And then in May, we will do the same with our English learners. Please note that the order that they are in does not mean anything other than that is the order in which they appear in the playbook. So it's not anything more than that's the way they're in the playbook. Again, the playbook digitally is accessible, as are all of the resources at sccoe.org. And if you click on anywhere on that carousel, it will take you directly to the Inclusion Collaborative website, where you will find excuse me, the Ways to Equity playbook and that's accompanying tools. You will also find all of the previous recordings to not only the sessions that we've been doing in these networks, but there are also other equity institutes, they're called, that you can find here that have been recorded. And just thinking back on today's discussion regarding master scheduling, there is a session in a previous session in there on how you can take more of an equity lens when you're developing your master schedule. So just a selfish plug there. But there are quite a bit of tools and resources available for you. So again, please feel free to share the Google form link with colleagues. Please encourage your colleagues to join us. And we would like to say thank you for joining us today and in continuing to be an equity warrior. You get a little bit of the gift of time. We will stay on if there's other questions that you want to pose. We're happy to stay on for a while. But again, thank you, everyone. Have a fabulous day.
Thank you, everybody. We are delighted that you hung out and participated with us till the very end, and we'll see you next month. Bye, Tara.
Do we ever download the chat for them and put it somewhere for them so that they can access the links and stuff, or?